Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with Sindhu Rajasekaran. We have an amazing guest here today, Nilakantan RS, who is the author of this brilliant book called South versus North. He is the chief data scientist for one of India's largest fintech firms. His primary interest is designing stable, decentralized systems, be they for political entities or business related processes. He has written on India's federal structure for publications such as The Caravan, Wire.com, and The Hindu. So, welcome, Nilakantan, and thank you so much for joining me today. Yeah,
Thank you so much, Sindhu. I'm quite excited to be here.
great. So, let's start with like the basic thing about data, right? We live in such a post truth world, right? Where in this world, like, what is data or what is fact? Because sometimes I feel like people interpret the same data in different ways or the same fact in different ways. Questions for you are like, can data lie, right? And also, can people collect or influence statistics in a way to sort of, imply something?
Sure. The answer to all of those questions is always a yes, right? And this is something that I, in the over the past decade or so, this has been a question that has sort of crept up quite frequently in public discussions of some kind. And at that point, we should remember that data, by virtue of it being a number and not being prose, is certainly not a different form of information. It is information, and it is subject to the same. However it is that you can skew prose with, you can skew numbers with, right? It's just a different way of representation of facts, right? That is what
Mhm.
all communication of all human beings, hopefully are. And to that extent, can data lie? Sure. What is the and therefore what do we as human beings, both in terms of producing data and consuming data, do? Apply our critical thought to it with the scientific method that we are trained in, right? Like, for instance, if somebody comes and tells us, gives us data that sort of beggars belief, what we do is we apply basic sort of statistical techniques. Nobody expects the layperson to have college level statistics applied to data that is presented to them. A high school level application of it, just to make sure that it makes sense, is all that is required for the consumer. And similarly, for the person who is producing it, of course the bar is a little higher, but that person has to go through the same processes that any kind of any intellectual output requires a certain rigor. That is true for data, that is true for prose, that is true for other argumentation of any kind, right? And so the same techniques that you would use in order to basically figure if something is true or not when somebody writes something, in fact, they're easier to apply when it is data, because what you do is you basically ask yourself, is if it's a survey, is was the sampling done correctly? Does this data suffer from confirmation bias, sampling bias, things of that nature? And can we, despite it having errors, can I still trust it enough that I glean some information out of it, but not take that as gospel? These are all things that we do for regular prose, and we should do that for data as well.
Right. So, what you said, that was interesting, right? Like, because it's not just about the collection, but also about the interpretation of things. Like, how methodical and how detailed are you in how you're interpreting that particular data. So, the question would be, if say, there's an example that you give in your book about how, when in commerce and industry, when they come up with state rankings, sometimes states that maybe are not the best so show up higher than states that are economically doing better as a great so do you think it is like you were saying, is it to do with, like, is it politics, like politicians can really affect statistics, or does it also happen in the corporate world, like you collect data to prove what you already want to say?
It is true everywhere. Forget, at least politicians and corporations have a motive, profit motive, which is tangible. like students when they talk to each other just to prove themselves right quite often do this, like
Mm.
people when they talk to people on Twitter do this all the time, right? So all human motivations to end up being right, we want to make sure that our argument wins, and therefore we present the information that we have, be it in the form of data or any other form, in this way, right? Which is why, for instance, whenever there are survey data information released, one of the things that aggravates me so much about Indian polling, especially when it comes to election psephology, is that they don't release the methodology,
Mm.
right? So whenever there is data that is put out in the public domain, there are certain basic matters of hygiene, and if they are not followed, you should not take that at all, give that any credence, right? If there is a polling company which puts out data and they don't give you the methodology, you shouldn't take it, right? Or you should ask them, why is it that the methodology is not given, right?
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, if the government of India, for instance, puts out a lot of questionable data. Similarly, I speak about some of that in the book, for instance, right? For instance, they rank states. One of the things that they like to rank is the uh, how much each state uses up funds under specific programs of the union government, right? It's a measure, and then they use that to rank states. Now, when it is said like that, it seems reasonable. Except one of the factors that uh, it's called the Good Governance Index, and the government of India sort of puts it out and measures states on this basis. And one of the factors that they use is the utilization of funds under this program called my Hindi is terrible, and so I'm going to butcher this, but it's called Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, right? It basically builds roads for villages, and and it essentially builds roads in villages that do not have road connectivity, right? Now, if you see that program's utilization for Tamil Nadu, it's generally zero, right? And therefore, the state gets very low rank on that utilization of funds. If you
Mm-hmm.
see why, there are there aren't any
They already
villages in
have
Tamil
roads.
Nadu. Yes,
Yeah.
right. And when the government of India uses this in order to rank states, it becomes problematic, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that is
Mm-hmm.
the problem. It's true for electricity as well. There is a similar program which essentially uses, the utilization of funds, or how many new villages have been electrified in the last year, so on and so forth. Like Tamil
Mm-hmm.
Nadu has not had a village that has not been electrified in like 40 years, right? So it becomes, and same is the case with Kerala. So it becomes very difficult when you sort of rank. Uh, long story short, you have to look at what is the data that you're looking at, what are you using it for, does it make sense, right? These are
Mm-hmm.
not, you don't have to have a PhD in statistics to do any of this. This is just common sense.
Right. So it's a lot like cherry picking, sort of. You're
Yes,
just picking
yes.
whatever suits your purpose.
Yeah.
So let's like dial back a bit here from the data, because like I told you before we started, like I'm horrible with numbers, right? I actually failed the civil services exams in India for two reasons. One, because all the names were in Hindi, Prajan Mantri, whatever. I couldn't remember any of them. And second, numbers. And I had to leave the country out of shame. So it was like, because in my family, everyone's a civil servant, like they're all officers. And I'm like, they were like, you can't pass this one silly exam, you know? I'm like, no, sorry, not for me. But let's just dial back a bit and talk about
On
concepts
that
like which
note,
you.
on that note, right? Like this is one of the easier, less Sanskritized names that I just rattled out. Don't be impressed by that. There are these, particularly there are programs in health for maternal and child mortality, which I, for the life of me, cannot pronounce because I'm too Tamil to pronounce that. And
Yeah.
it again, it is like it's almost like the government of India does not want certain people to read about it because they just get turned off by the name. But yeah,
Yeah,
continue.
yeah, absolutely. Like, honestly, I feel like these days when people ask me, like, where are you from? Who are you? Like, I'm like, I'm Tamil.
Yeah.
It just feels. I'm like, yeah, that's me, you know. But anyway, let's dial back a bit and talk about concepts like democracy, nationalism, and federalism, right? So you do speak about this a little bit in your book, and what are the problem? We'll come to that later. But I just wanted to talk to you about like the ideas in general, what it means, and how in Plato's Republic, for instance, he says the ideal state is a utopian city state, right? And which is ruled by a philosopher king. And or like in Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is more about superpowerdom, they say that he says that if you do you need a government because otherwise there'll be Matsya Nyaya, there'll be like chaos. But then even with a government, it's still Matsya Nyaya anyway, in today's reality. But I just wanted to ask you your thoughts about in India we had like the Janapadas, right? The Mahajanapadas, and the during the Buddhist times we had like the city states. Those were the way it was like, and then we slowly came into the superpowerdom, like But India was never so totally sort of ruled by any one power. There were feudatories, they were like feudal states, but they were not really like just become like one. And it is a very post-colonial thing that India is essentially a forced marriage of many states that may or may not have wanted to be one country. So when we talk about, people think essentially democracy also means like the marriage of states. They don't understand federalism. They think that talking about federalism is like treasonous. uh, you know so what two questions: what are these concepts to you, and how did you get the guts to write something like this? I mean, it's sort of like, especially like in today's India, right?
Right. So, to answer the last question first, if you grew up in Madras like I did, the idea of the incumbent political party that is in power, for instance, until the 1960s, 64, until the war with China, it had explicit secession as part of its foundational principles. So it is not uncommon for somebody who grew up in Madras to think this way, right? But to answer your original questions in terms of the philosophical understanding of what is it, what is federalism, or more importantly, in my mind, I think the more fundamental question is what is the nature of organization of society is the question that we need to ask ourselves, right? And if we believe in the Enlightenment ideas of equality and okay, can you? It says can't
Yeah,
access
you
the
come back
audio.
now.
Okay, great. So if we, am I frozen again?
You're frozen, but I can hear you.
Okay, all right. Sorry. I think. Okay, I think it just picked the wrong. Give me 1 minute. Okay, I should be okay now.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Sorry. So can I restate that?
No, you'll have to start again.
Okay. Okay. All right. So the we'll have to start again from the beginning.
No, just what you were saying now.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I think it is so if you grew up in Madras, it is relatively easy for you to not be scandalized or think that speaking of federalism is treasonous. Like it did not even occur to me that speaking or thinking thus is considered treasonous until I sort of lived in Delhi NCR for a little bit, because there are people who actually think that, and it sort of shocked me that people think that. But be that as it may, that's a quirk of our politics. Park that aside, right? Like the basic question, or the philosophical question here is, how do we organize society in the era that we live in, with the principles of equality, which are probably one could argue they're outcomes of the Enlightenment movement, but like you didn't need to have Europe to basically tell the rest of the world that people are generally equal and they should have an equal say in the way in which they govern, right? So Enlightenment is sort of the moment I say that there are multiple segments of people who get upset about that, as if I'm saying that Europe invented equality. No, it's just a useful sort of a shorthand for that,
Mhm.
right? But be that as it may, if the fundamental question of that we have is, how do we organize our society such that we everybody has a relatively equal say in the way in which our society is organized. The animating question then becomes, how do we represent the will of the people in our government,
Mhm.
right? And this is true for all kinds of revolutions, right? Like the French Revolution did a rather violent and ugly version of it. The American Revolution did another version of it, right? Like most revolutions are sort of extreme answers to this basic question if you were to look at it, right? And the independence movement in India was some version of it as well. But the question is, it is easy when you have a single sort of a colonial power against whom you're fighting, and it is easy therefore to forget what is the reason for the for 1.4 billion now to sort of stay as a single government. There is very little in common between, let's say, me and somebody from the northeast of India who speak very different languages, have very different cultures, so on and so forth, and true for the Indo-Gangetic plains as well, right? Now, I could think that they're different. Somebody who is from the Hindu right, for instance, would basically argue that it is not different and they're all the same, because they would argue there's a civilizational state. Fair. But the question then becomes, who gets to decide this? And the way we decide that, in my mind, should be that it should be an organic agreement from the bottom up. It cannot be a top down imposition, right? Like, somebody who lives in Delhi cannot tell me that, I am, or rather, I have to be part of their design of what the country is. I have to agree to be part of that, right? Or at least people in my part of the world need to agree to be part of that. And that is the core principle of enlightenment, right? Now, if you are to think that this is a structure which is what is reasonable, that is, the consent of the governed is a necessary condition for having a modern government, right? Like, we believe that is a civilized way of running societies. If we do that, then the most reasonable way then is to not have a top-down structure saying that this is the map that we have decided and everybody within the political boundaries of this map shall belong to this particular union. Is not the way to go about it, but instead ask people from the bottom up, do you want to belong to this particular union? And once you do, we will draw the map, is generally how we should do things, right? And if you believe
Ideally.
that, right, and if you do that, then all these concepts that you just mentioned, including federalism, become bedrocks of that bottom up approach.
Mm-hmm. So then people wouldn't be so scandalized by it. Like you said, for me it was never a scandalous thing because I grew up in Madras. It was, always, and in those days we were still talking about Kashmir having a referendum. It was still okay to talk about that, and later as a university student in Edinburgh, Scotland was talking about a referendum. They had one. So it's like, for me, it's not, I don't think of it as, oh my God, like, how can you talk about this, right? But it's become such a seditious or treasonous thing to say now, especially in India. But just to go forward with what you just said about, these concepts should not be a problem in a place where you respect people's opinions, right? So you do speak about this later in your chapter about democracy and how the first past the post is good for horses, you said, but bad for democracy, which I think sort of encapsulates what you just said, right? Like, because in a representative democracy, if you're just looking at first past the post, if it's all about just the electoral numbers and not really about what the states really need in terms of specifically like individual states, what they need, to develop. So can you just talk about that, about what is the problem with first past the post?
Sure. Before we talk about that, I think we need to understand a constituency in India, like a parliamentary constituency in India, is the size of a small European country, right? Like, just the number of voters, forget children or non-voting populations. Just the number of voters is greater than 2 million. I think there are enough countries in Europe which have a population of less than 2 million, right? And the reason why I bring that up is we elect one MP to represent those 2 million voters in Parliament, right? And it is it is mathematically impossible for that person to represent the will of the people of 2 million people effectively in Parliament, even if that person were to have the freedom to do so. Our political system does not even allow him or her to actually do that, right? Like, if we elect an MP, it's only that we elect them in name. The political party that the MP belongs to controls the way in which that MP votes on the floor of the house. No? So it's even more complicated. But even if we imagine an ideal situation where that MP is some kind of a free agent, where they can vote on how, in terms of how their constituents want them to vote, it's not a fair way of transmission of the people's will, right? Like, because there's assume that there's me, probably, we take 10 others in South Madras, which is the constituency that I live in. It is impossible for our MP, Dr. Tamilchi Thankapandian, to basically represent all of our will equally in parliament, right? Like, and park that aside, what is aggravating in this? So already an MP, however you choose, for such a large constituency, is unable to transmit the will of the people simply because there's a problem of mathematics there. And as the size of the constituency grows, this problem becomes worse. But park that aside. The second problem then becomes that because India is a multi-party democracy, the winning candidate very often has less than a third of the votes, which basically means that more than two-thirds of the people in that constituency did not want this candidate, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
firstly, it is impossible for anybody, even if 100% of the people voted for that MP. On top of that, two-thirds of the people do not vote for that MP, and then that MP then has to go and belong to a party and vote on the basis of what the party tells that particular person to vote. And let me give you an example here, right? Let's say for whatever reason, the BJP MP, there is a BJP MP from some part of Tamil Nadu, right? Now, for whatever, let's assume that is a possibility and that somebody wins. Now, the BJP, by virtue of being who it is, needs to be honest to its base voter who are in the Indo-Gangetic plane, and therefore it will uh, come up with policy propositions which are more fair, so if we were to say politely, to that part of the country, and that is its job as a political party, right? And that is going to be against the interests of this BJP MP from, let's say, Tamil Nadu. Now, this MP can't do anything in the way in which that MP, he or she, has to vote along with the BJP, because the party issues a whip saying that
Yeah.
every MP belonging to this party should vote yes or no for that particular bill, right? So we have this problem. So the first past the post system sort of we have a problem in terms of electing the MP in the first place, because you could very well have an MP who for whom two-thirds of the people did not vote, and then we make that MP go to parliament and vote, where all 100% of the people might be against his or her vote in parliament, and then the way in which it becomes law is again problematic, right? So this is, in other words, the current parliamentary system that we have has a very weak transmission efficiency. Or, in other words, if the purpose of democracy is to represent the people's will, the transmission efficiency of representing that will is the way in which you measure how good that democracy is. And if we were to do that, because we have the first past the post system, because we have MPs voting on, we have what is called the anti-defection law, which essentially makes parties control the ways in which the MP votes. Because of all these things, the transmission of people's will is practically
Haven't
zero.
there been instances where people have been like cordoned off in hotels and stuff so they do not, defect and vote for the other?
Yes, yes.
Honestly, that's just anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is remarkable, right? I'm not arguing that the absence of this results in the anti-defection law results in a good system. You have the opposite happening in the United States, where every senator thinks that that person is the president of the United States, right? Like all 100 of them basically think that they are the president of the United States. That has its own problems, right? So
Right.
the question then becomes, how do we design a system such that there is just representation of the people's will with sufficient safeguards? So that is the question.
Right. So I want to take that to the next question I had for you about subnationalism, right? That's the word that you use in your book. Now, is that always the same as ethno-nationalism? Which is a question.
Right. So I would argue no, and there is it's a wonderful book that Prerna Singh, a scholar from Brown University, wrote on why subnationalism actually results in greater development. But be that as it may, ethno-nationalism. So these are like subtle differences between patriotism, nationalism, etc. Right? But the point is, it's always a question like, whom do you consider as your in group and whom do you consider as your out group, right? And what do you want to do with it, and how do you want to structure your society such that the opposite of that is, if we didn't have boundaries, then why do we have a boundary between India and its neighbors? It's because
Right.
for some reason that And therefore where do you draw that boundary is the question, right? So philosophically
Mm-hmm.
there is no problem drawing boundaries even for quote unquote nationalists, right? So why is subnationalism a problem? Because they have a certain concept of what the in group is, and if
Mm-hmm.
another group within that group sort of has a different definition of what their in group is, they seem to have a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is the degree at which this becomes so animating that they call it treasonous or seditious? That's a different question. But the point is, you can have an illiberal version of this in group. The
Mm-hmm.
moment that becomes an illiberal version of that in group, it becomes, ethno nationalism is an example of that illiberal version. You can have ethno nationalism as a sub-nationalist idea, you can have ethno nationalism as a nationalist idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
In many of these Eastern European countries, you have ethno nationalism, and it's a
Yeah.
nationalist idea, right? And the
Yeah.
only difference between India and those places is that India is such a large country that each of those countries will become a state in India, and that's why these become sub-nationalisms in India, whereas those are ethno-nationalism nationalisms
I mean,
in those
honestly,
countries.
most of the time I'm astounded that India's like the way India is, the way it runs, because it is Europe. It is like Europe.
It's
It is like it is all these different, because historically these are thousands and thousands, of years old, right? And they have their cultures, they have their languages, they have their,
forget the history and the other things which I'm always a little wary of talking of history, because the moment you speak of it, then the Hindu right sort of twists it and says that that's the reason we should be X. But the point I want to make is slightly different, which is that the size, take Tamil Nadu for instance, or Maharashtra for instance, right? Tamil Nadu is the size of Germany in terms of its population,
Mhm.
right? Like, is anybody going to argue that Germany should not be a country? It's one of the large. It is the largest country in Europe. Similarly, France, right? Like,
Right.
many states in India are bigger than the biggest countries in Europe, right? Like, it
So
is no.
so that leads up to my next question for you, right? Because now we spoke about like all the larger concepts. So now let's just come to your hard data, like the actual facts of things. So I don't know the numbers. I'm going to trust you and the book. So I've not done my own research. When we talk about the regional imbalances in India, right, which is what made you write this book, and you talk about how is the South an unequal partner. Now, first of all, let's define what the South is, because I've lived in Mumbai for many years, and first of all, people in Bombay think they should be a city state like Singapore. They feel like they're being dragged. That's another story. So what are the South states according to you, and what are the regional imbalances between the South and the North?
Right. A little bit of a disclaimer, right? The title South versus North is a catchy title, which initially I didn't think. I came up with some obscure title, which thankfully my publisher sort of vetoed, and they came up with this title, which has helped the book sell a lot more. But the South versus North is sort of a it's an attention grabbing title, right? But we
Right.
should we should not focus on, therefore, what is the South? Is Maharashtra South or North? Those are complex. uh, for the purpose of this book, Maharashtra is probably not in some cases, probably is in some other cases. In terms of all social development indicators, we should include Maharashtra, because Maharashtra has done quite well in terms of its health, its education, and so on and so forth. When it comes to tax devolution and therefore resource allocation problems, Maharashtra is not as acutely affected as the other southern states are, right? The other five southern states are.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, for that purpose, we could probably argue that Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka are primarily the southern states. But that's an academic. I don't think we should focus on that. Hopefully,
Mm-hmm.
people read this book, and the thing that they take with them is that the way in which the Indian Union is structured, with a very strong union and very little powers to the state, is a bad idea to run such a large country. I hope that is the
Mm-hmm.
message that people take, and not
I
worry
mean,
about what is
you gave
south.
a title which is sort of, it's sort of like sort of pitting it against. You did write in the print, which I thought was a good article which I read. South versus North debate isn't divisive. One nation, one policy is, which is what you wrote in the print. So if we can talk about that, I think that is what the crux of the
Yeah.
thing is for you.
Yes, absolutely right. Now, increasingly. even at the time of independence, the way in which India was structured was that the union was meant to be the more powerful entity, and states were less powerful by design. Now we could disagree with that. The Constituent Assembly has a long discussion on this. In fact, the original idea was to do the opposite and have extreme sovereignty, fiscal sovereignty to the states, which is what Lord Mountbatten in the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, originally came up with. But the Indian
Mhm.
National Congress at its time vetoed that, which is the reason why we have what we have. But the problem in the current state of affairs has become that the divergence between India's southern states, particularly Kerala and Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, on the one side, and the Indo-Gangetic plains on the other, have become such extreme. These two sets of states have become extremely divergent. And I quote this example in the book, which I kind of like giving because it tells you how different these states are. Kerala, and before we get into the metric, I just want to say, how do you generally measure states? It's not by GDP numbers or whatever. Those are important, but if you were if you were to look at developing societies, the metric that is generally used to measure not just health, even other, the general stability of a state, is to look at the infant mortality rate, right?
Mhm.
Because it tells you how well the health infrastructure is working, which then gives you an idea of how many doctors the state is producing, how much it is caring about its expenditure in health. It also tells you how are there medical facilities near where people are, and are they well stocked. And more importantly, it tells you about the education system, because slightly more educated people seek care for their children better, so on and so forth, right? Like,
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
research to prove that the general sort of society's well-being is in fact measured by the infant mortality rate of that particular society, right? And in fact, in many of these African countries, a rising infant mortality rate has often predicted civil war, right? So
Mhm.
we need to take that into context. Once we do this, sorry, you were going to say something.
No, no, I was just going to say that you do mention in the book that how the median child in the South is healthier, wealthier, and is more secure in a way.
Right, and the extreme example of that is consider the state of Kerala. It has an IMR, or rather, it had an IMR of 6 when I wrote the book. I think it has dropped to 5 now, but maybe. But let's consider 6, right? And it was at the time I wrote the book, 6 was its IMR was comparable to the United States,
Mm-hmm.
right? The mightiest country that the world has seen. Nobody is arguing that the health system in the United States is the greatest, but it still is a very, very wealthy country, and it's not comparable to India, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Kerala's IMR is comparable to the United States. The IMR in Madhya Pradesh at the time I wrote this book was 48. That is comparable to Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, it is. I don't think there is anybody in this world who will argue that we will have the same health policy to run both the United States and Afghanistan. Right?
Yeah.
It's
No,
just
absolutely.
it's
That's the
mathematical.
that's the thing that you
It's
write in the book as well that I find very interesting because you talk about how the states that have done better are penalized because okay they've decided okay we won't have so many children because it's putting a stress on our family, our economy, all of that. Let's have fewer children, let them have better lives, all of that. But the states that have done that since independence have been penalized because it's more like I'm looking for that word that you wrote somewhere where you talk about the status quo of the South. Like, so basically if you develop so much you have to wait till everyone else catches up with you. You can't get anything more. So it's like a marriage where it's like unequal partnership, right? Like, so you're like, if you're not as good as me you have to, or if you're way better than me you have to wait till I catch up with you. Or so how will we be a happy family then?
Yeah, the question then becomes, should we be a family? But park that aside, right? But
Yeah.
the question then is, at least if if there are such divergences and you essentially have a United States and an Afghanistan within the Union, the way to run that is to let these two societies worry about, figure their own health priorities, right? Because it is it is unfair not just to Kerala, it's also unfair to Madhya Pradesh, right? Because the
Mm-hmm.
kinds of interventions that we want Madhya Pradesh to have are things that won't work in Kerala, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if we sort of, arrive at the arithmetic mean or some version of that as policy between these two societies, it will work for neither,
Mm-hmm.
right? For instance, what does Madhya Pradesh want? Madhya Pradesh, the thing that it needs is that, it needs to basically get more women into. One of the greatest reasons for the high IMR in Madhya Pradesh is that a lot of the what is called institutional delivery rate. That is how many women deliver their babies in some kind of a institution where they're cared for, is very low. We need to improve
Mm-hmm.
that, right? Like states such as Tamil Nadu and Kerala have a near universal rate of institutional delivery, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for take Tamil Nadu for instance, how did it achieve that? Like in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, they basically had a scheme wherein they said, you come to our institutions, we will build an institution, and they did. In every remote village there is, and we will sort of, they had a doctor have serve in every one of those primary health centers and use that service in those primary health centers as one of these incentives to for those young doctors to get admissions into postgraduate programs. It was a whole host of things, right? Like, but the point is, now that Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and to a lesser extent Karnataka have achieved this, sort of focusing on these input metrics won't help. They now have to focus on more advanced technologies to look at more complicated cases, because if you've progressed a little bit, then additional progress is more difficult, more expensive, so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Madhya Pradesh, it's an easier sort of society-wide intervention that is required. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're sitting in Delhi and deciding on policy, these two sets of states have exactly opposite requirements. What do? Right? Do you focus
Mm-hmm.
on input metrics or do you focus on output metrics? One set of states have achieved that input metrics and are now at a stage where they need to focus on output metrics. The other is in a stage where they have to focus on input metrics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason why we need to let these states sort of figure their own thing out is because what is optimal policy for these two sets of states is orthogonal to each other. It's not just that they won't slightly work; they will work cross purposes, and that
Mm-hmm.
is the reason why we need to sort of have the union take a backseat and let states run their own show,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
So,
that
so when I just want to cut in there to ask you, because people listening to this maybe don't understand all the details of this, right? So when we're talking about a union like India, for instance, now the center has they allocate the resources in terms they collect the tax, and then they decide we're giving this much money or any other resource to every state. So that's how it works out. So is there no way, like in India, that a state that pays more tax or is more sustainably paying tax or more tax, does it not get any benefits or any sort of incentives?
Yeah. So this again, remember like how a few minutes, probably 10, 15 minutes ago, we discussed about a program which I can't pronounce. One of those classic examples is precisely what you speak about, which is it is called Matru something. I can't pronounce it, but anyway, it is a program that the union government runs for maternal and child welfare. Essentially, it is the program that is going to impact the metric that we've been discussing this far, right? And it is a single program, it's a single program with single targets for both Kerala and Madhya Pradesh, right? Now, earlier, like 20 years ago, this program did not exist, and we used to run it at the state level
Mhm.
before the. And I'm not sort of, this is not a function of this particular government, right? Like all central governments through
Right.
India's independent history have done this in some way, shape, or form. Except what has happened is that with every passing year, the union government has usurped more and more of these state powers. All I'm trying to argue is that forget tax devolution. The minimum that, of the devolution that has already happened, let's say that, Kerala has 100 rupees and Madhya Pradesh has 100 rupees. For the point that I want to make here is, do not take away 50 rupees off that 100 rupees, pull that into Delhi and design a single program for both Kerala and Madhya Pradesh from Delhi. And this, at this point, is called the Central Flagship Programs, which the union government runs, of which this Matru something is like, one of them. right?
Hmm.
So it runs, and let me give you the order of magnitude of these central flagship programs. The total budget that Nirmala Sitaraman presented last year for the central flagship programs was, I think, of the order of some 3.8 lakh crore rupees, right?
Hmm.
That is 150% greater than the total amount of money that the union devolves to all states. So when you essentially have the union retain such a large amount of money with it and design programs for what are state subjects and implement them on its behest, you're going to end up having, these divergent states have policies that are, antithetical to their own interests, and that is what
Hmm.
is happening. So the way to achieve this tax devolution is one thing, but at least the least thing that the union should do is it should do less of what it is doing, send that money to the states, and then worry about tax devolution, which is a later problem.
Hmm. So, just to go back a little bit to the politics here, right? You also talk about how in your book you talk about as time goes on, these states that are actually doing better have lesser political representation because they have lesser population. So it's sort of like a vicious cycle where they don't have political representation anymore. So who's going to actually fight for them
Ex-
or their
exactly.
priorities?
Exactly.
So yeah.
Exactly right, and that's the reason why, in fact, I write in the book that southern India is the. This again is a point where Maharashtra differs, which is why we sort of came up with that definition, right? But anyway, southern India is at the threat of being reduced to a vassal state exactly for these reasons that you spoke of, right? One, we are taxed and we don't have control of how much we are taxed because the union government holds the power of the purse. Two, we are forced to run policies on basic aspects of running our society without having access to, tweaking those policies to best suit us, which basically
Mhm.
means that we don't have a say in the way in which we are governed. Three, the way in which you change either of these, be it tax or actual policy, is to have representation, and that's how a democracy is supposed to work. And now,
Mhm.
with the threat of delimitation, what is happening is that we are now forced at the exact time when we need greater devolution and greater sort of policy, say in the way in which we're governed, exactly at that time, there is a threat of our representation being cut. So, if you do not have a say in the way in which you're taxed, if you do not have a say in the way in which you're covered, and if you do have, decreasing representation, that is the hallmark of a vassal state, right?
Right.
Be
Right. Like it's a bad deal. Like what's
yeah,
going
it's a
on here?
yeah.
So
The history is rife with all of this. There's no,
mhm.
Vichy France, for instance, or how the Chola Empire used to run its vassal states in Southeast Asia. These,
Mhm.
Southern India is getting dangerously close to those examples.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the thing is, we're talking about it based on actual data, right? And we are being rational and logical about these things. So I just wanted to ask you one more thing about this development. What is development, right? So we are usually, I mean, we are talking about things, parameters like health, education, economy, stuff like that. But do everyone in India define development and progress in the same way? Because that also is a problem, right? What is development? Like people are, it's like, okay, yeah, your state wants to develop in whatever, but that's not development. We want something else. We want to build something else. Like that's development for us. Like, there are all these push and pulls that happen in Indian politics, right? There was a meme I saw on because on Instagram about something like हमको रोटी नहीं चाहिए हमको मकान नहीं चाहिए ना हमको jobs नहीं चाहिए हमको मंदिर चाहिए stuff like that, like like what do people want, like what it's different for every state, I think.
So, if people want a temple and not basic life amenities, that's a personal whatever. That's
It's a
politics, right?
choice.
It's a choice that they make. Good for them, right? I mean, I hope to have a conversation with them, but I have I give them the right to have that choice.
Yeah, fair, it's fair,
As a
no
good liberal,
judgment.
yes. But the point I want to make is, as disinterested a matter of policy, if you want to measure societies and look at development, the way to look at it, and I'll tell you what, right? Like I've had a lot of friends in Delhi who somehow think Chennai or Tamil Nadu is not developed because they don't see enough of a high-rise building. So I don't know what they think,
I've heard
but
that too.
you've heard that too, right? A friend of mine has, says this quite often, which is that they think we are conservative because we wear saris. That's what
Yeah,
she says.
we don't expose ourselves enough.
But anyway, but the point is, whatever, and they're entitled to that opinion. But the point I want to make is, if we want to measure a society in terms of what development is, the basic way in which you do that is to look at what is the contribution of industry and services, or rather how little agriculture contributes to the economy. Because as societies improve, the contribution of agriculture to their GDP sort of decreases, unless you're some extreme corner case like Denmark. In general, it decreases, right? One. Two, the number of factory jobs is basically the way in which you measure, because we can't have high-end service jobs that probably you and me hold, but we want to have large manufacturing jobs in a developing country, so that it's a pathway to middle income or upper middle income, right? And in order to have a large number of manufacturing jobs, what do you need? A large number of factories, right? So if you measure and here is where, and if we accept that these are the ways in which we want to measure development, so to speak, what do we need? In order to have a large number of factories, it's not as if some corporation in California or in Europe basically decides to come to a place and set up a factory because the government has given it tax stops or anything. The reason why companies come and set up factories, or people in that state set up factories, is because they have this availability, which is the greatest distinguisher between two states, is that there is an availability of skilled and healthy manpower, because you need people to hold jobs, right? So given that, and it's a virtuous cycle, right? We've spoken enough of vicious cycles, let's speak of virtuous cycles, right? So
Yeah.
if you essentially have a population that is reasonably well educated, is reasonably well fed, is healthy enough, and has sufficient skills to hold a factory job, enough factories come there, and then that gives them the ability to educate their children even better, and the society moves up. And this is how we should measure development in a given society, right? If we do that, let me give you two sort of data points. One, the uh, gross enrollment ratio, or the number of kids who go into college, and as a ratio of population, right? That is an important measure in terms of how well a society is educated. And Tamil Nadu, despite being a large state, has the highest gross enrollment ratio in higher education at 52%. That is more than 1 in 2 kids in Tamil Nadu sort of end up in college these days, right? And park that aside, what is the result of all of this over a last generation of sending our kids to school and college? Therefore, the total number of factories in the state of Tamil Nadu, at least when I was writing this book, was 38,400 or 600 something, right? That is greater than the total number of factories in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, what other state am I missing? Uttarakhand, put together, right? And the states that I told you, these 6 states in the Hindi heartland, they have a population upwards of a 500 million. If they were a country of their own, they would be the third largest country in terms of population, right? And
Yeah.
Tamil Nadu is a state of 70 million people, and it has a greater number of factories than all of these states combined, right? And that is development, right? So what is development is that if you're born in the state, you have a reasonable shot of being educated, being in school. You have a reasonable shot of being healthy, staying alive, which is kind of important. And because you're healthy and you're reasonably well educated, you have a reasonable shot of being employed. And given that there are such a large number of factories for a relatively small state, the wage pressure keeps moving up, so you're also better paid. So if you look at the wage rates for non-agricultural work, they're the highest in sort of the southern states, right? So in my mind, that is development. You're born, you have a reasonably good shot at staying alive and being reasonably healthy. You have a reasonable shot at being educated and going on to college. You have a reasonable shot at getting a job of some kind, and that job actually pays you reasonably well. And over and top of that, your political representation and sort of thoughts of federalism sort of help you achieve that to some degree, which is all under threat, but that's a different matter. But The idea that you have these three, four things is what development is in my mind.
I absolutely agree because I've heard that too, right? I've heard a lot of people say to me, I've lived in Delhi, I've lived in Bombay. I've heard people say, oh, Tamil Nadu is not developed, like, Madras is so backward, like, because everyone's like so conservative, because they're all wearing saris, they go to temples all the time, there's no high rise buildings, like, it's just not like a party state, like, it's not like everyone's, I've heard all of these things. But that's a interesting thing. We should have another chat some other time about how Tamil Nadu is that sort of it's a rationalist progressive state, but it's also a very religious state. There people are very religious there too, and there is a sort of push and pull bit, and it's always been that way. I mean, Bhakti movement started there. Those are different stories. But what it means to develop according to these sort of parameters that you just mentioned, so that's very interesting. So among the other South Indian states, what are the states that have good parameters in terms of these, health, education, or economy?
So, in both health and education, Kerala is an unquestioned leader and has been now for like close to 100 years now, right? Uh, uh, and Tamil Nadu is almost catching up with Kerala, right? Karnataka has made significant improvements in health. Its education numbers in terms of gross enrollment ratio, particularly for women in high school and above, is sort of not doing as well as it should compared to other southern states. But in other factors, Karnataka is doing quite well. Telangana again is the excellent story, much like Tamil Nadu. Wasn't all that great like 50 years ago, but is catching up really fast and has almost caught up entirely with Tamil Nadu and is marching up towards Kerala. Maharashtra again. Given that we sort of are not too sure if we want to count
We'll
that state
assume
or
they're
not
south for now.
for now, right? In terms of health and education, they're excellent. In terms of economy, again, they're excellent, right? Like so, Maharashtra is in some way, shape, or form like a everything. What used to be said about West Bengal a century ago is probably true for Maharashtra today, which is that India basically runs in Maharashtra because it's such a large state and a relatively prosperous and developed and well performing state, right? So these are all states that are doing quite well. The problem has always been the Indo-Gangetic plains. It has not always been since independence. It has
Yeah,
been
since
the
independence, yeah, because they
right.
have had amazing, cultures and civilizations and
Yeah, yeah,
economies
yeah.
back in the day,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. If you, in fact, I cite that in the book. If you look at the data between what was United Provinces at the time of independence and what is
Hmm.
now Uttar Pradesh,
They were so rich.
yeah, and Tamil Nadu was like indistinguishable from the Indo-Gangetic plains at that time. So it's a favorite hobby horse of some people to basically say that the North has always been under whatever some oppressive state of either the Mughals or the Brits, and therefore they were bad. Data doesn't bear that out, right? Like
Yeah.
it is policies of post-independent India that have resulted in this growth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now since we're running out of time, the last question I have for you is about the gamified direct democracy that you talk about. Can you explain what that is and how that will improve India?
Sure. And I'm so glad that you asked me this question. Before I get into that, here is a minor pet peeve of mine, right? Like when I wrote this book, I was, like you said, because of the rather provocative title of it the politics of it, I thought, it would become controversial. None of that happened. It has been very well reviewed. I sort of became a bestseller. So I'm quite happy with it. But one of the pet peeves that I have is that a lot of people restrict themselves to the first two-thirds of the book where I go through all of these differences and data points, etc. And a lot of people have just entirely ignored the solution that I have. So I'm so glad that,
So I focused on the first bit and the last bit because I skipped the numbers.
so like we discussed a while ago, if we were to agree that the transmission efficiency of the will of the people is the basic problem that is animating much of these, and that is the central thesis of my book, what is the solution? It's if we were to look at the old DMK platforms and basically ask for a separate Dravid Nadu or something like that, it doesn't serve the purpose, because at the end of the day, if you have like one union with like a serious problem which is essentially transmission of the will of the people, if you sort of draw a line between the two but still retain the same structure of government, instead of having one problem you're going to have two problems. It serves nobody's purpose, right? So the way in which you solve for this problem is to think of a system wherein the will of the people is reasonably well represented. After that, if people want whatever the way in which they want to be governed, good for them, right? But the solution needs to be one that represents the will of the people reasonably well, right? Now, if we were to agree with that, I look at various systems around the world. So if we were to do away with first past the post, then the next reasonable alternative is ranked choice voting, which many European countries have tried. But the problem then remains that because of the size of the constituency in India, that still remains a problem. So I go through a laundry list of those solutions, and finally arrive at what is the Belgian model, right? What they do, at least in one province of theirs, is that they have essentially divorced the parliamentary power, that is the power to make legislation, from the power to of bringing legislation, that is the calendar of when legislators get to vote on it. When you
Mhm.
divorce, what happens is you take away power from the political party bosses, right? One of the greatest powers that a political party boss has is essentially these two things, right? Which is that order MPs how to vote, and figure when to bring legislation so that you can be tactically astute in terms of your politics, in terms of electioneering, right? If you take this power away from the party boss, then a lot more freedom happens, right? So
Mhm.
and that's a reasonably good idea. But that still retains the extraordinary inefficiency of us electing an MP, which where each constituency is about 2 million people in India, right? So the good alternative to that, if we were to look at history, is the Athenian model of direct democracy, right? Wherein,
Mhm.
in ancient Athens, people were basically called to the city square and asked, the problem of the day was discussed and deliberated, and you could argue only free men with property were allowed to
Yeah,
vote.
of course. I mean, it's not utopia. Never was.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But let's assume that we do away with those ugliness and have all universal adult franchise, but in this direct democracy way, right? But
Mhm.
the problem then becomes that that society, after all, wanted Socrates dead. It sentenced Socrates to death by poisoning because he wanted
Mhm.
people to be thoughtful people, right? In
Yeah.
other words, the threat of such a direct democracy is always that it is tyranny of the majority. And looking at India now, I don't have to warn you that that is a possibility, right? It's a very
Right.
real possibility. So the question is, how do we? So if we have this Athenian model of democracy, we have perfect sort of transmission of the will of the people. But the risk is that we risk tyranny happening, right?
Mhm.
And then imagine you also have this idea of eliminating the calendar from the party bosses, whatever. So eliminating the powers of the So imagine that we have a system wherein we have arrived at direct voting with some
Mhm.
guardrails. Imagine that the ability legislative calendar is divorced from the legislation itself and
Mhm.
the drafting of the legislation. So however much we might dislike parliament, one of the core competencies that it has is that it drafts technical legislation, which is a
Yeah.
skill in itself, right? So how
Mhm.
do we do that, right? So in my mind, these are the three-legged stools. How do you, if we were to divorce the calendar from the legislation and the drafting of the legislation from the calendar and the legislation, have these as three distinct entities and have sufficient guardrails for all of them such that it does not descend and devolve into chaos, we would have had a reasonable system wherein the will of the people is represented, but it does not descend to chaos, right? So how do we do that is the question.
Mhm.
So imagine that we do away with the MPs, right? We
Mhm.
all of us vote straight.
Yay.
Yeah. Okay. So if we do that, then what happens? We want to safeguard against people basically saying, I don't like that guy, let's hang him, right? So how do we do that, or or things of that nature, right? So how do we
Yeah.
do that? The way in which I propose in the book is that imagine that every voter is given n votes to begin with, right? And to start with, let's assume that in the last 10 years of the Lok Sabha, let's say, how many bills were passed or how many times an MP was asked to vote every year in Parliament, right? I looked at the last 10 years data. The average of 10 years is about 182, whatever. Whether you want to have that as 182 or you want to have that as 20 or 100, that's a question that we can get
Mhm.
into. But let's assume it's 182 for now, right? So let's assume I give you 182 votes. We give everybody 182 votes.
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, what you can do is you, if, however, the problem then becomes what is the thing that they vote on is something that nobody knows. So
Yeah, yeah.
right. So
We have all these
the
votes, but what are we voting for on?
for, right, yeah. So basically, anybody can come up with a possibility of a bill which will
Mm-hmm.
become a legislation, but in order for that to become, to be for a vote amongst the larger population, they need to have at least 20% of the population say yes for it to be brought into
Right.
the larger vote. So that is
Mm-hmm.
step one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in step two, let's assume that it passes that. In step
Mm-hmm.
two, what we do is we basically say that if you want the legislation to pass, anybody can vote for it.
Mm-hmm.
However, you're allowed to use one vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if it passes, your overall vote, if it was 182 before it passed, and you voted for it, and it did pass, your number of votes remaining with you becomes 181, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but if it did not
Right.
pass, if you voted no and it still passed or it did not pass, doesn't matter. You still retain your 182 votes, right?
Okay.
That happens. But more importantly, if you want to vote no, you're allowed to use all 182 votes to vote no,
Mm-hmm.
because
Interesting.
because because we want to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority.
Right. But you can vote yes only with one vote.
One vote, right? And if
Oh,
you vote
interesting.
no, your votes will not reduce. Whereas if you vote
Mm-hmm.
yes, your vote will reduce.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the logic of this is that if we have such a system, we are it will be a very slow movement forward because there is always the ability of people to veto something, right?
Yeah.
However, the we are we are paying this cost of slow movement for protecting people against tyranny and majoritarianism,
Mm-hmm. Because
right?
we have the right to say no to something that we
Yes,
disagree with very vehemently.
very vehemently, right? And if you imagine this kind of a system in this three-legged stool, wherein we have a separate committee for deciding when the legislation needs to come into effect, and a separate committee, and I speak about how to choose those committees, democratically. So we'll go into that, read the book for that. But let's assume those two committees exist as well. The way in which this will move forward is that, for instance, nobody in Kerala or Tamil Nadu is going to accept. Let's assume the union budget is getting passed, right? Nobody
Mm-hmm.
in Kerala or Tamil Nadu or Karnataka or Maharashtra is going to agree to this Matru program, which basically
Mm-hmm.
decides for whatever, right? So what will happen? What will happen is that many of these things which the union government has usurped from the states will not pass at the union government,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It will just not pass because people will be against it. Now, if it does not pass, some government needs to do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, and therefore, what will happen is that, and if you're so essentially, you have a layer of government which is whose ability to execute some policy is being blocked by the people democratically, and therefore they will also refuse to pay the taxes which fund for that, hopefully,
Oh, it sounds very cool.
right? So it will automatically descend into the lowest level of government, and they will fund that government to do what they think is best for, in other words, power will automatically descend to the government that is closest to them, which they think has the greatest ability to impact their lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And and,
Right.
and, and, and because power descends, money follows power, and therefore tax collection will also hopefully descend into that layer of government, so
Mm-hmm.
that we will have a naturally decentralized system of government, instead of us fighting for Tamil rights or having ethno nationalist concerns. This will have a mathematically stable version of just descending to the lowest level of government, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is gamified direct democracy, because what you're doing is you're protecting the minority, but also ensuring that the will of the people gets represented in their government. And you want to sort of go away from this behemoth which is becoming the Union of India, in terms of its union government, which is usurping all of states' rights. You want to do away with it, but you don't want to give a shock to the system, so it does a natural movement down.
So in a country of the most populous country in the world. So if we had to give everybody the right to vote like this, in a gamified direct democracy, which sounds really brilliant to me, like, that's. I mean, I think the older I get, I feel like I think anarchism is the way to go. Like the way is like, each human being has to have the right to determine what they want in the world, right? So if we were to do that, would that be all digitized? Because that's how this can be done, right?
Uh, you see, that is a question of detail. How you want to have these votes? Do you want to put
Hmm.
it on blockchain? Do you, like if you
I'm
talk to
just
tech?
concerned about like people's privacy and stuff, because
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah.
all of
I
that
mean,
will come into.
right. Absolutely agreed. Right. Like, see, the method of executing the election, we can have it in the way in which we are doing it now. And if somebody thinks
Mm.
of a better system of, doing the elections, good for them. Right. If you talk to a bunch of tech pros, they will tell you the way to do this is to put it on a blockchain. Great. Whether I,
I hang out with tech bros all the time, so I
right.
totally know what that is.
Well, in their defense, I am one. But be that as it may, right? The how you execute it is a matter of detail. We can execute it in the way in which we're currently executing it. The question is the philosophical way in which we want to govern ourselves. If we agree that gamified direct democracy is a concept, is a reasonable concept to go after, you know, implementation is a matter of detail.
Right, right. No, but I think that sums up our conversation really well. Like, I think give the power back to the people. I think that's
Yes.
the ultimate goal of your book and the
Yes.
ultimate goal of what I want as well for people, right? And this has been a really amazing conversation, Nilakantan. I'm so happy that you came on, and we actually shot over more than I thought we would. Actually, I could talk to you for much longer, but we will have another talk about Tamil Nadu specifically and Madrasiness, because I know I said we should talk about that. We didn't get to talk about it this time, but that is a another topic for another time. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Absolutely. It's been such a great thing talking to you first thing in the morning. Thank you so much.